In a world that's moving faster than ever, there is an appeal to slow things down, to feel, linger, and experience more, and with greater depth. It's something that I think has to do with a longing for a time that wasn't as complex, a kind of nostalgia for things that are real. And I feel like it's been manifesting for the last several years in how we dress. On a day-to-day basis, I connect to this thought on the streets through the vast proliferation of thrifting, but also through trends like cottagecore and the more relevant to this video trend of craftcore, which champions hand craftsmanship in clothing and the visible skills behind them. Today, I want to dive into an evolution of this trend that I'm going to refer to as Sentimental Craftcore or Curated Nostalgia as a movement in menswear to consider for your own wardrobe. So stick around and we'll take a closer look at maybe the most well-known example of this, Bode, as well as several other lesser-known global brands that embody the kind of hand craftsmanship and artisanal techniques that Bode is undoubtedly inspired by. I will also talk about why you'd want to add this dimension to your wardrobe, as well as provide some ideas about how you might go about it. So let's get into it. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Peter's Prism. Sentimental Craftcore is about more than just handmade clothes. It's about clothing that tells a story, a longing for lost craftsmanship, family heirlooms, and imperfect beauty. Now, before I continue down this rabbit hole, I want to ask that if you've been enjoying this channel and want to support the work I'm doing, please consider becoming a channel member. It's a simple way to help me keep creating thoughtful, design-focused content, and in return, you'll get early access to new deep dives just like this, along with exclusive posts and members-only extras. Just hit the join button below to learn more. Thank you for considering it. So, what is Sentimental Craftcore or Curated Nostalgia? It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's the opposite of rigid tailoring or cold minimalism. It embraces hand-stitched mending, antique fabrics, embroidery, and delicate materials that are usually absent from mass-produced menswear, commonly available through giant retailers of fast fashion. When I look at clothes in this category, they feel personal and more human, and to me they signify a quiet rebellion against fast fashion and industrialized sameness, or stiff and robotic minimalist styles. To better understand the emotional pull of curated nostalgia, I want to go back in time a bit and talk about Gucci, Wes Anderson, and the arts and crafts movement that started in the late 1800s. I promise this is all going to come together at some point, at least I hope so, because it did in my mind. So after decades of globalization and technological acceleration, I'm sure you'd agree that there's a growing sense of disconnection from nature, from heritage, even from our own hands. Alessandro Michele specifically captured this feeling in the mid-2010s when he assumed the creative director position at Gucci in 2015. Important to note that this was 1 year before Bode was founded. And at the time, fashion was in a very different frame of mind. Eddie Slimane was at the helm of Saint Laurent with his rocker minimalism. Thomas Mayer was dosing out measured bits of color at Bottega Veneta, and Miuccia Prada was following a decidedly austere 70s vibe. Alessandro Michele's first collection for Gucci that year really created a shitstorm that shook all of this up. It went from Frida Giannini's almost stereotypical idea of a jet-setting nautical man to a radically different vision of menswear. Michele, who was at Gucci from 2015 to 2023, laid a crucial foundation for the rise of Bode's aesthetic by reshaping mainstream fashion's relationship to nostalgia, maximalism, and eclectic storytelling, all central tenets of Bode's identity. He really brought to life a dense, vintage-inspired world that treated the past as not some kind of rigid archive, but a flexible mood board that mixed prints, patterns, and textures, and evoked a warmer, gentler, and more sensitive idea of style. The looks were like walking cabinets of curiosity, and the clothes felt like living documents. Pieces seemed archival despite them being brand new, and there was an obvious, meticulous attention to handcrafted detail. Practically every garment he designed felt as though there was a narrative embedded in the textile itself. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go back in time a bit further to talk about the filmmaker Wes Anderson, who, by the time Alessandro Michele was blowing up at Gucci and Bode was founded, had already cemented his vision of romanticized history in pop culture through his color-coded, saturated worlds rich with symmetry, details, and nostalgia. His movies were incredibly curated, with sets that felt like they were from an unknown past, yet simultaneously timeless. And the characters were often dressed as though their clothes were inherited, collected, or lovingly handmade. Going as far back as 1998's Rushmore, for example, Max Fisher's school uniforms of wool blazers, crested badges, and striped ties were an idealized, romanticized version of traditional school attire. In 2014's The Grand Budapest Hotel, Gustav H's uniform was immaculately tailored, but also looked as though it belonged in another decade. The purple bellhop jacket with red piping, especially, felt like a relic of a better, older time. And in 2018's Isle of Dogs, an entirely stop-motion animated movie, which in and of itself is nostalgic, tiny imperfections were visible throughout. The slightly uneven fur on the dogs, the rough stitching on the clothes, the weathered, stitched-together quality of Trash Island. It was all visible labor that spoke to themes of loss, loyalty, survival, and love. It was all very deeply emotional. Handmade, textured, rooted in emotion, deep nostalgia, and a reverence toward traditional craft and techniques. These are all ingredients that informed Wes Anderson's films, inspired Alessandro Michele's collections at Gucci, and ultimately helped blossom the incredible reception and rise of Bode. Now, I want to go a little deeper still because why not? So let's talk about the arts and crafts movement, which started in Britain in the late 1800s as a reaction against the Industrial Revolution, when factories were cranking out cheap, mass-produced goods, and a lot of artists and designers felt like something important was being lost, notably the human touch and the soul of making. People like William Morris, a textile designer who was a key influence on the arts and crafts movement, believed that everyday objects like furniture, wallpaper, and clothing should be beautiful, handmade, and meaningful. They thought craftsmanship could uplift society, reconnect people to their work, and restore pride in simple, well-made things. The movement celebrated handmade work over machine-made, made use of natural materials like wood, wool, and leather. It valued imperfections as a sign of authenticity and kept production local and ethical way before these became buzzwords. So if you think about it, the arts and crafts movement planted the seed for what we're seeing with everything I've covered so far. It's slower, it's the opposite of mass-produced, there's storytelling inherent through the choice of materials, and there's pride in visible craftsmanship. It's all in the same spirit. The arts and crafts movement taught us that true luxury isn't perfection. It's human hands leaving their mark. And today's Sentimental Craftcore is simply the newest wave of this same impulse, to resist soullessness with care, memory, and craft. When Emily Adams Bode Ajla founded her namesake brand in 2016, its identity was built around rescuing and repurposing antique fabrics. So think quilts, tablecloths, ceremonial textiles, and reworking them into entirely new garments. When you look at a Bode outfit, it feels like it belongs in a Wes Anderson movie. It looks handcrafted. You can see and touch details you know were executed by hand, and it's sometimes impossible to tell what some pieces remind you of, but they do remind you of something from the past. Today, much of ready-to-wear from Bode is no longer made from dead stock or vintage fabrics, but the emotional core of the brand is largely the same, and the brand continues its traditions, with a smaller collection of one-of-a-kind pieces. Handmade techniques are still front and center, imperfect and personal details are celebrated, and there's a lot of storytelling inherent in the textiles and details. These trousers, for example, are inspired by an embroidered tablecloth from the 1950s. The floral patterns were reproduced with beadwork. They also reproduced the fabric for this shirt, which was inspired by a dress from the late 1920s and added appliqued stripes at the collar, cuffs, and hem. And this jacket, which was inspired by an antique quilt from the early 1800s, was reproduced, including the prints, and finished with hand ties to affix the batting and lining. And like the art of quilting, so much of Bode's collections are stitched together in a dreamy patchwork of histories, some real, some imagined. It's really no surprise that the brand resonates so deeply with people, as it connects to a craving for authenticity and personal connection in the luxury fashion space. Bode's exponential rise in popularity wasn't only about antique textiles or one-of-a-kind pieces, although those were key selling points. The brand essentially opened up a whole new emotional space in menswear, a place where craft, memory, imperfection, and nostalgia lived side by side with luxury. As a result, we are now seeing many more brands that are interpreting sentimental craftcore, but each slightly differently, while sharing the same emotional DNA that Bode has championed. Story MFG, for example, which is based in the UK, shares Bode's love for visible craftsmanship, and their clothes often showcase details like embroidery, crochet, or patchwork that highlights human hands over machine perfection. Story MFG also leans into ideas like eco-idealism and zero waste, avoiding animal products, and ensuring that dyes and materials are non-toxic. Another proponent of sustainability is the Los Angeles and Paris-based Human Assembly, which also reinterprets old world styles and details through vintage sourcing, upcycling, and hand embellishment. Their vibe feels a bit more global cosmopolitan archive in that a lot of the styles feel workwear and Americana inspired, while others have a distinctly Japanese or European character. Their clothes are made in countries including India, France, Japan, Portugal, and Turkey. There's a flea market sensibility to a lot of their designs and presentations, which contributes to that eclectic global vintage mood. While Found is based in New Jersey, the brand, which was founded by Faraz Zaidi, is inspired by his South Asian heritage as well as his rural American upbringing. This cultural blend is evident in the clothes, through evidence of craftsmanship as well as a sense of the past, but through a modern lens. Some pieces feel streetwear influence in their cuts, for example, while maintaining this nod to handcrafted details and a reverence for vintage. Kelsey Peyton Crane is the designer and founder of KPC, the Atlanta-based brand whose offerings are all limited to one of one, and truly embody the idea of a piece of clothing as a unique heirloom. This camp-colored shirt, for example, is made from a 1950s tablecloth, and this one is made from 3 different cotton chenille coverlets from the 1930s and finished with hand tufting. In her product descriptions, she notes that all of the textiles she uses are 50 to 125 plus years old and may contain irregularities or areas of irregular color, which is exactly what this style is all about. When you first encounter a piece from Bode, it feels familiar. Not just because of its vintage shapes, but because of something deeper stitched into the fabric itself. Bode's designs often carry the spirit of South Asian craftsmanship, visible handwork, narrative textiles, and a celebration of imperfection as beauty. Even when reimagined through a nostalgic Americana lens, there's a clear emotional thread linking Bode's style to traditions found in countries such as India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, just to name a few. These cultures, of course, have their own authentic stories to tell, and their aesthetics reflect the richness of their own traditions as seen through a modern lens. And this is where brands such as Kartik Research, Sejauh Mata Memandang, Maligaya, and Randolf come in. Each of these labels isn't just participating in an idea of curated nostalgia, they're expanding it, grounding it in real local traditions, and pushing the conversation beyond trends into living, evolving craftsmanship. Each of these brands offers a compelling and deeply personal vision of the very aesthetic that this video is all about. Kartik Research, for example, moves beyond the idea of vintage revival into present-day living craftsmanship, and centers Indian makers and communities as active contemporary participants in that process, not just as a source of aesthetic inspiration, but building new narratives directly with the artisans themselves. So instead of simple references, they co-create textiles, cuts, and designs with Indian craftspeople today, honoring tradition while actively evolving it. This block printed shirt, for example, was made in collaboration with local artisans from Maharashtra of 100% cotton, while this shirt features hand embroidery done in Uttar Pradesh of hand-woven fabric. Sejauh Mata Memandang, and please forgive me if I butchered that pronunciation. Their menswear exemplifies a harmonious blend of traditional Indonesian craftsmanship with contemporary fashion sensibilities. The brand's commitment to sustainability and cultural preservation is evident in its use of natural fibers and dyes, as well as its collaborations with local artisans from regions like Sumba, Bali, and Java. Traditional techniques, such as batik and tenun, are central to the brand's designs. They're reimagined, though, through modern silhouettes and patterns, making these clothes accessible and appealing to a more fashion-conscious audience. For instance, the Baju Bapak line features long-sleeve shirts crafted from lurik, a traditional striped fabric, but presented in contemporary cuts. Maligaya, a Filipino brand, taps into the nostalgic craftcore sensibility, but doesn't just stop at recreating vintage looks. Instead, the brand pushes craft into the present, making it a part of a living, breathing, and modern Filipino identity. The brand might reference traditional Filipino garments or craft techniques, but they're new and modern expressions using unique antique fabrics like lace or tablecloths in these shirts, or linen souvenir tea towels mixed with Irish linen and embroidery. Another Filipino brand, Randolf, also draws heavily from nostalgic craft traditions, but transforms them into new ideas that feel current and sometimes quite witty. There's less straightforward reproduction for the sake of sentimentality, and more of a sense of irreverent reinterpretation. Randolph often uses techniques associated with traditional Filipino clothing, but then infuses them with surreal, humorous, or pop culture-driven storytelling, such as these barongs, made of traditional pineapple fiber that feature whimsical embroideries like tattoos, hearts, or doodles. While I've highlighted the brands Kartik Research, Sejauh Mata Memandang, Maligaya, and Randolph to illustrate how nostalgic craftcore is evolving across Asia, it's important to recognize that they're just a few examples from a much larger group of global designers that are embracing slow, sentimental craftsmanship, each drawing from their own rich textile traditions in their respective countries. In Japan alone, techniques like Bode and sashiko stitching offer centuries-old examples of how hand repair and patchwork can become deeply personal, almost poetic art forms, a sensibility that continues to influence brands globally, including those inspired by Bode's success. Ultimately, what ties all of these expressions together is the evidence of the human hand, the imperfection, the hours of labor, and the visible care. As I said before, it's a quiet rejection of fast fashion's disposability and a celebration of clothing as memory, art, and as something meant to endure. In the end, it's not just about looking vintage or handmade. It's about feeling a connection to real craft, real history, and real people. All right, if you're still with me, chances are you are somebody who cares about design, quality, and possibly finding meaning behind the things that you wear. And that's exactly why Sentimental Craftcore or Curated Nostalgia has so much to offer you. In a world where fast fashion and logos can sometimes feel loud and impersonal, adding pieces with real craft, visible stitching, hand embroidery, vintage-inspired textures immediately signals something different. It shows a deeper kind of style, one that's rooted in story and not just trend. So when you bring in these kinds of elements, you're not just putting on a shirt or a jacket, you're layering your outfit with intention, with history, with texture. Even a single crafted piece, something say with visible handwork or is slightly imperfect and feels lived in, can completely change the emotional tone of your outfit. It makes everything feel a little softer, a little more human, without losing sophistication. And if this sounds appealing to you, know that you don't need to change your whole wardrobe overnight. You can start small. Think about adding 1 or 2 pieces that feel handmade. Find an heirloom or a garment or accessory that's clearly time-worn. Find pieces to incorporate not simply because they're old, but because they either have a story behind them or at least feel as if they do. And if you have clothes that are worn or damaged, consider mending them. Learn techniques such as Bode or sashiko stitching and make visible repairs to your garments. Beyond the aesthetic appeal that these techniques will add to your wardrobe, you're extending their lives and you'll wind up buying less new clothing and thereby minimizing fashion's impact on the environment. The result of all of this is that your style can become more personal and add dimension where it didn't exist before. And without saying a single word, you communicate to those around you that you appreciate things that are thoughtful, individual, and lasting. It's less about being fashionable and more about building a wardrobe that can feel like a truer representation of who you are. And when I sit back and think about it, that's really what all of this is about. We're all in the monkey tribe together, and being able to share ourselves in a more authentic and emotional way will help make this short time we have on this planet that much more meaningful. So there you have it. Thanks again so much for spending a little time here with me today. If you've enjoyed this deeper dive into craft, nostalgia, and the stories behind what we wear, and if you believe, like I do, that great design really does have the power to elevate our lives, I hope you'll consider supporting this channel in whatever way feels right for you. Every bit, whether big or small, will help me keep making thoughtful content like this, content that encourages all of us to stay true to our own style, to move beyond trends, and to build wardrobes and lives with real meaning behind them. Because at the end of the day, great design can elevate our lives, if we let it. And true style, as I always say, begins by staying honest with yourself. So thank you again for being here, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye!